Hi, welcome to video number 6 on how to use the Caltrans Hot Mix Asphalt Smoothness Payment Adjustment Spreadsheet. This video 6 is titled Contractor's Completion of Analysis. So video 7 will cover full and partial width segment corrections. So we're going to cover everything except for full and partial width segment corrections in this video. Okay, so at this point in time we've saved our ProVal project file and our Excel spreadsheet using the naming convention that's required based on where this lane is, and we've saved those files. So we've also imported the existing profile. So now what we need to do is just take a look at what we have right now. So if we look over in column Q, and you'll see the second segment, there's some values. It says 103.4/173. What that is that's the MRI max and the ALR max. So you'll note that there's other segments up above that and below that are left blank. So when you see those segments that don't have any values in there, what that means is that it's defaulting to the standard MRI max and the localized roughness maximum value that are allowed. So in the case of a 75 pay table spec, or any layers that are less than 3/10, the MRI max is 90. Anything above 90 would have to be corrected if there was an MRI value above that. And localized roughness, anything above 160 would have to be corrected. Well, in this case, our existing pavement that we were paving on has got a 159, which is well above 135, so those thresholds they get raised up. That's how our specs work. So this will go away once we bring in the baseline data, and I've done that. I know that because I've done it. I've done it on this project already. Okay, so the other thing to note is that whenever we see boldface type in this column J, this is the MRI 0, that indicates that one of these values is above that. It's going to go into percent improvement. So when we see boldface here, we'll see the text in column N. It'll, instead of it saying 75 pay 450, which implies that it ties to the standard 75 pay table. Because our roughness of our existing surface is so high, now we're going to be using the percent improvement. That's what the PI stands for, percent improvement. That has a maximum pay of 450 per segment. And typically when we see a PI pay 450, we'll see some values over here in column Q. If we go down to the segment 13, that's on row 35, you will see a 95 and a slash, and there's nothing after that. Well, because there's no 160 after that, that means it's 160. So the MRI max happens to be 95. And if you did the math, calculated your MRI target, and you said 2.1 times that, you'd get a value, but that value in a lot of cases is below 160, but our specs is set to default to 160, so we don't lower it below 160. So that's how that column works. So we're going to go ahead and import the baseline profile now. So let's go to our ProVal project file, and I'm going to go ahead and click on ride quality. I've already got something run up here. I'm going to look at what I want to look at is the fixed interval report to get our MRI data. So fixed interval, our definition for mean roughness index is the average roughness of both wheel paths every 528 feet. So that's a fixed interval of 528 feet. I want the average roughness of both wheel paths. So if I leave it at IRI, I'm going to get it reported separately for each wheel path. I want the average of both, so the mean of both. So we're going to pick MRI. Okay, now there's a threshold value of 90 in here. That happens to correspond with our maximum MRI max threshold. We don't have to put a value in there, but that's just going to show us where there's MRI that's over 90 in our 528 foot segment. So I want to get that baseline MRI report, so I can go ahead and just click that baseline value and run the report, or I can click them all by clicking this profile selection button up at the top, or I can erase them all. I like to just run all these profiles at one time. And we want to make sure our apply 250 millimeter filter is set on. What this does is basically it smooths out the profile of each wheel path to account for the average contact area over 10 inches. That's like the higher contact length of the profile of the quarter car model. So it's, instead of just looking at roughness every inch, it's going to look at the average roughness of sliding 10 inches because that's what the tire feels. I'm going to click Analyze. Now it's doing the quarter car model for all 4 profiles. Okay, and now we're going to go, typically it defaults to the chart, and what we're looking at right now is because we ran all 4 profiles, it basically reports, it shows the chart down below of the first profile. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the correct profile, so we have to click the drop down below the ride quality here, and we can see the 4 profiles. I want the baseline, so I'm going to click baseline. Let me go back to the existing. So we can see also that we saw that we had values over 135. These are those locations where the MRI went over 135. We want to get the baseline and bring that in. So now we can see that, there is no localized roughness above 135. So all the payment adjustments on that front sheet are going to be based on the 75 pay 450 table. They're not going to go into percent improvement. So we're going to go to the table. We're going to right click, copy the table to the clipboard, go back to our spreadsheet, and on the baseline worksheet, go to the top left corner, Control V, we just pasted that information. We go back to the cover sheet, and we can see the baseline information got brought in here. Now we have this column that's called MRI 0. Our specs basically say that we're going to look at the lowest value of the existing in the baseline and call that MRI 0, and this is what we decide. This is what determines if we're going to go into percent improvement, because the lowest of 159 and 92 is 92. It doesn't go to percent improvement, and we can see that it goes to the 75 pay 450 table. So I'm going to unselect. I'll explain that later. I should have had that unselected when I got to this worksheet. That doesn't have anything to do with what we've talked about so far. Okay, so now everything's 75 pay 450 on this whole table. If we look up here, the total number of segments with mandatory corrections, and every one of these say must correct right now because we don't have a pave or final profile in there. Once we bring that data in, it'll clear itself out and show a proposed adjustment. This next cell is number of segments not certified free of ALR. So the reports that we can get out of ProVal, we can't set them up so that it would read the information automatically. So the user has to go into ProVal and then certify that all the segments are free of localized roughness. So once they do that, they put a 0 here. We'll cover that briefly in a second. So, okay, so now we've got the baseline in here. We know what this whole job is going to be 75 pay 450. Just the standard 75 tables. Now let's go to the pave profile, and we'll go back to our baseline. We'll go back to the ProVal project file and get our pave profile. Run the fixed interval MRI, 528 feet, and I'm going to clear them all and just select that again because the Analyze button wasn't activatable because it had already been run. So we can see now all I have is the pave profile. I'm going to right click, copy that table to the clipboard. Make sure I'm on the pave tab and paste it in. So now we can go back to the pay adjustment table, and we'll see where we had all these must corrects. Now they have dollar amounts, but they have strike through in them because we haven't certified the localized roughness to be 0. There's no localized roughness. So my payment adjustment, when I go to the equations in our specifications, for a 63, it's going to be $312. For a 65, it's going to be $189 per tenth mile segment. And I have to certify that they're free of localized roughness. So if I could do that, I would put a 0 in there. So let's go back to take that next step that a user would have to take. So we're going to go look at the localized roughness for the pave profile. So to do that, we're going to go to continuous. We're going to select, we want to look at both wheel paths because that's what we care about. We want to make sure our threshold is set to 160. This will often state 90, so this is a common step where people might forget to change this 160. This 90 to 160, and I changed it here. So now we're looking at we want to look at the pave profile, analyze it. And I can see that there's a lot of locations that are not free of ALR. So now I'm going to go ahead and assume that I have to do corrections. Okay, so and then we'll have a final profile that we can analyze. So we'll go back to that ProVal project file and go to our final worksheet. We don't have data brought in yet, and So now we're going to go get the mean roughness index for the final profile. So I'm going to go fixed interval, MRI, 90. I'm going to pick that final profile, analyze it. Right click, copy table to clipboard. We're going to bring that back in. Okay. Now we're going to go back to the pavement adjustment. Now we have the existing baseline pave and final in here. So the way this works is that these dollar amounts are based on the pave profile until we put a check in this box in column O. And once we check that box in column O, it's going to use the final profile. So I have a 63 for the pave and a 62.03. Right now this dollar amount's based on the $312 adjustment. Once I put a check mark here, it's going to use the final profile, except that it is not going to increase any incentive. So I would not expect it to go up. So when I check it, it recalculates it, but it won't pay more incentive because we can't grind into incentive, and that's the way our spec reads. If this was a disincentive and I chose final and it was smoother, we would decrease our disincentive, but we can't increase an incentive by using the final profile. So I could select them all. We'll go ahead and do that with that one check mark. I had that accidentally checked before. So now we're using the final profile on all these. And still, there's one mandatory segment correction down here. So, I'm not sure why this is over 92. I think maybe it had to do with a shortened segment, but I'd want to use the pave profile, so I can unselect that, and then there's no adjustment that's calculated for that. So that's kind of how that works. So now every one of these dollar amounts has an incentive calculated, but it's got strike through in it because we haven't certified that it's free of localized roughness. So now we would go back to the final profile, and we want to look at the continuous IRI report for 160. We want to look at the final profile, analyze it. And there's our threshold of 160. There's a couple locations that are over 160 still. So in this example, we'd have to go back and do more corrections, but in this example, we're going to assume that these are all below 160. So we're going to put zeros on these segments where these are covered and make an assumption that we corrected it all. And then if we were to submit this to the RE, he would reject it, and he'd send this back to you. So we're going to go back in to put a 0 here. When I put a 0 on this first row, it's going to basically display that 312, and then we have one less segment that's not free of, or one less segment not certified free of ALR. So if I put another 0 in there, now it went from 67 to 66. So I can just go ahead and make the assumption that everything is, that all the segments don't have localized roughness, and put them all to 0. Now, there's no red here, or we don't have any must corrects, we don't have any ALR issues, and it displays our payment adjustment. Okay, so there's another step I kind of skipped. I just wanted to jump ahead and show you how to do the payment adjustments. So when we bring in the baseline profile, we have to our profiles have to be within a specified alignment of the existing stationing. So when we look at the existing station, every one of these segments has a begin and end station. When we start comparing profiles one to another, we have a rule on our spec that says they have to overlap each other within a certain criteria. So the way our specs read is within the first mile, the end station of each one of these segments has to be within 20 feet. And then once we get over 2.5 miles, it has to be within 50 feet. So all these segments, this is the first 10 segments correspond to the first tenth of a mile. Then the next 15, it gets prorated from 20 up to 50. And then the threshold, once we get over 2.5 miles, is 50 feet. So we can't have any one of these stations be more than 50 feet different than what is shown on the existing IP. So this column I shows us what the difference is between these end stations to give us an idea how far we're getting off. So we're good here. If there was any issues that were different, it would display. Now this column F it shows the locations of the partial segments, because typically if you have red, if you fall out of alignment, it's likely going to be because you have a different leave out, or there's leave out on a different segment, or it's the wrong length. So we display the leave out segments here so that you can compare them to what was on the existing. Excuse me, these are the leave out segments that were on the existing. We can see the partial segments of these profiles in column C and compare them to the partial segment length that's on the existing profile. Totally messed that explanation up, but this is the existing. So if these two values were different, we'd start seeing that there were some differences. These are provided just to give you an idea where something might have gone wrong. So okay, so we can go ahead and look at the pave profile, and if there are any cases where we're out of threshold, we see red. So we can see that this segment, there's an issue. The length got 67 feet out of spec, and we can take a look here and we can say, well, that partial segment was 68 feet, and this one's 25 or 0.25 feet. So that's the reason why it's that far different in stationing. So we'd have to go back to our ProVal project file and fix this. Okay, we can go look at the final profile, and everything's within line. Well, it's the same thing. We have the same issue where that profile ended too short, I would say. They should have stopped it further down, or the existing profile was too long. They should have shortened it. So all these segments, when we start comparing them, they all got to line up within essentially 50 feet, further on down the road. So that's the first thing you would want to be doing. If you're a contractor, you get your existing IP, and then as soon as you get your baseline inertial profile, enter it in your spreadsheet and make sure everything's lining up. And once you get your pave, do the same thing, and then get those things fixed before you import them into your final profile that you're going to submit to the resident engineer as a payment adjustment. Okay, so we're going back to the spreadsheet. So here's the total dollar amount adjustment that once the engineer verifies it, he'll make that payment adjustment. So in these next videos, we'll have the engineer go into these orange tabs here, and he's going to import that same data that you brought from the ProVal project file, and he's going to bring them into these sheets, and he's going to paste them into his yellow cells. And once he does, he'll clear out all the red, and that's going to indicate that you didn't make any changes to your data, so that you pasted into these spreadsheets. The engineer's doing the same thing. He's just going to be verifying it. Okay, so that's the end of this video, and if you were to if you felt like you had everything good, you could submit this spreadsheet along with the ProVal project file to the engineer as your payment adjustment request. And once the engineer verifies it, he'll make the payment on the next estimate. That's the end of this video. We'll go on to the next video, and we'll cover what these two columns over on the left are for full width and partial width segment correction.